kind of rewrote the main part of it here on the board. So they introduce to you 2005 poem. They tell you in there, write your well-written essay, and then they give you your charge here. And so I want you to think about how we can approach the prompt in terms of two words, the command and how we can conquer it. And so when we look, you always want to find that word in the prompt that more or less gives you your verb. And it's always going to relate, we've said, around the concept of analyzing. Keeping this in mind may help some of you that are still struggling with, I feel like my essay just summarizes, or I feel like I'm just qualifying examples of what the poet is doing. Remember, that's not our point. We've got to analyze here, which forces you to explain the meaning that you find in the piece. So it's not about explaining what it literally means. We're getting towards explaining this concept. And so when we look at this idea of what are they commanding us to do, we've got to analyze, but then what is it that we are analyzing? Bless you. We can break this prompt into the two parts, the verb and then kind of that charge. So we're analyzing how, and again, that word is really key. If we changed how to what, then yeah, we could absolutely summarize here. But that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to talk about how, which means we need to look at the choices made by the writer to create the meaning. How the poet portrays, we come back to this word complex. So for sure, I would mark that. I would remind myself of the conversations we've had all year, that when we discuss complexity here, what they're wanting to see is something that's multifaceted. So we have said you can express that with a blank yet blank statement to be able to show a contradictory nature. But we do not have to use this construction. We simply want to show that there is more than one side to what we're seeing. And that's something that we're going to focus on today to kind of make that clear if you missed it. But then we get this part. What is this complex relationship? And this question adds it in a little bit more because we are used to complex relationships between two things. And here they're going, hey, can you reach out and talk about three? And so we have the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. Most students did really great on 1 and 3. What am I putting in 4? This second one, though, they struggled with. They struggled with engaging that idea of the implied audience. They understand that the poet is addressing you, seemingly the reader. But going beyond that, they were like, I don't really know how to talk about this. We're going to try to hit that today for what can we point out? How does she want us to understand this? In breaking apart the prompt this way, the command section is your first, where again, you're isolating. What's the verb? And then what is it that we're supposed to do? To be able to approach the conquer point, which is, okay, how do we do it? The suggestion is to really sit down and ask yourself 3 questions and force yourself to come up with some guiding questions for reading the passage. In order to conquer this, we have to ask ourselves, what's the info we need to know based on how this is put together? What is it we need to understand about the passage? How does the author present that information, which is where we're going to kind of stretch a little bit? And then what are they arguing about it? And this is where we get more towards that idea of analyzing. We have to understand that all texts do present an argument of some sort. And this should remind you a lot of last year in a language class, because all you do is analyze argument. We can read text as an argument because what we see is the implied meaning that we walk away from is seemingly what the author wants us to understand. In order to help us with this conquer task, to do it effectively, you have to construct some questions in your own head before you read the passage. And we're going to give you a little bit of a challenge here. All of these questions need to start. It's on my shoe. Cool. All of these need to start with what is or how does? Forcing ourselves into these frames for the questions are going to help us to answer what we're seeing here rather than abstractly just throwing things out. So let me give you an example. If this is our command, in order to get the conquer, we know we need to look at like, what's the info we need to know? So we can ask a question like, what's the relationship between? And then this question is going to have multiple parts because we got three different things. So we need to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between the speaker and the audience? The speaker and plants. If you notice, all that we're doing here is helping to frame what do I need to do as I read the passage. Sometimes with poetry, students have a really hard time, and we've talked about this all year because it's not always literal. There's not a plot to follow. There aren't characters all the time. And so when you get it, we've said it's all about experience. That's still really amorphous. But if we can start to put it to some tangibles about, hey, as I'm looking, can I define these pieces? It may help you in your approach. Based on the prompt, can anybody come up with another question to help us out here based on a what is or a how does?
What is the author display the relationship?
So notice here, we have a tangible kind of carry through. We can start with a what is, but we also are pushing with the how does. And so for some, being able to express these questions can help them to give the passage that look. Now, I'm not at all going to go through here and make us do, hey, let's write every question. No. Again, this could be really helpful, but I also don't want to just beat somebody with a stick if they're like, I got this, can we move on? Absolutely. If you would like to see this in practice a little bit more, linked on today's Canvas page at the very bottom, the last link is a helpful resource. It takes you to a web page that kind of lays out this approach for how to deal with any kind of a prompt. And specifically, they're looking more at poetry prompts. They do provide released sample essay prompts from the test and kind of show that thinking. They also take you to using a chart, which might help you if you're having a hard time with the difference between summary and analysis, that basically you lay down three columns. Column 1 is the tangible, what's the quote? Column 2 has you express what they're doing. And column 3 asks, how does this build meaning? And so you can see that on that page. We'll work in similar ways, but it's really based on the questioning that we've done all year too. Let's focus instead and talk about the poem a little bit more here and start to dig into, okay, if we understand the passage or the prompt, now how do I apply that to the passage? So first, let's start with a common problem as I checked everybody's draft work from last week. Not a common problem. We are seeing it much less significantly in the last few works, but still we said every time we talk about something it's going to come up. How do we designate the title of a poem? You put it in quotations. If you're not sure, take a look at the prompt right in front of you. Look at the actual prompt itself, and they show you right there how to write the title of the poem. They have it in quotation marks. Ultimately, are you going to gain or lose points if you can do this skill? No, absolutely not. But if you can't follow this simple skill, then yeah, if you're wondering, why do I not do well in these essays? Well, if you can't fix this yet, that would be why. Let's talk in general. One of the things that this prompt has us focus on is the speaker of the poem. we want to remember that the speaker is not the poet. Lots of essays we wrote and that got wrote nationally want to identify Olive Senior as the speaker. They want to frame this because it does have those constructions to it as though the poet is the speaker. No, absolutely not. I will even show you this and you will laugh about it. The structure of the AP test is really changing. If you haven't noticed this, we will do this on test day. Think about it. How do students your age tend to process information online? You might not realize it, but a lot of times memes are an easy way that we see adults, people process information. How do they present it with pictures? How do they help to explore something with it? And so after the AP test, of course, everybody has to sign that little confidentiality thing. I'm not going to talk about the test for 48 hours. Well, I don't want to violate that for you. So I'm not going to ask you what the questions were. Instead, I'm going to look at Twitter and look at the memes that people post as they get out of the test. Because I can usually figure out what pieces of text they chose based on that. Well, with that in mind, we've also noticed this world is a lot more connected and the boundaries are starting to disappear a lot more. On test day, students realized that Olive Senior has the Twitter. And so they started bombing her Twitter, asking questions about the poem. Yeah. And everybody was just like, whoa, we did not expect that. Holy crap. She had to post a general comment first. She said, I don't hate plants. Quite the opposite. My poem shows how clever plants are in devising so many methods for ensuring their survival. Read again. She even had a student more directly send a question to her and ask about what's there. She asked her, wait, I have another question. Did the plants represent the white colonizers? And how many of you found that you kind of went in that direction because of some of the words like imperialistic? No, we're going to talk about that. She said, not really. But in the poem, plant activities are related to the human. So you can see parallels. Not everything in the poem is revealed to the author. The best poems invite the readers in. Your own interpretation is valid if you can support it with evidence from the poem. And I love to see a response like that from a poet because it's the same thing we've said all year. There are lots of ways with poetry that you can be right, and there are lots of ways with poetry that you can be wrong. But if you can support what you're seeing with the evidence from the text, that conversational nature of poetry invites you to come up with those things. So when we look, we don't want to confuse these two. We want to understand the speaker is not the poet. Let's start to kind of dig through here and look at what we have. What are some of the things that stood out to you if we start to talk generally about approaching this prompt and discussing it? Yes. Look at the first line. Look at the first sentence. It is declarative in nature and it is definite. To describe plants as deceptive. This is a start to an introduction of tone. Think about that word deceptive, deception, any of that. Do we have a positive or a negative connotation towards that concept? Negative. So if I'm telling you that the title of this poem is Plants, and the first thing I tell you is that they're deceptive, I am coloring your perception of what my approach is going to be. So if we're engaging here and talking about this complex relationship between the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life, we should be able to link those descriptions to the development of tone because it helps us to start there. We view them negatively. What are some of the other descriptions that stood out to you? Not that we have to catalog them, but just to give some tangibles.
Imperialistic.
Yeah, so if we go to that section line on line 8, to read imperialistic, we have our background from Heart of Darkness, so we understand imperialism. We have also taken history classes, so we have some understanding there. It is a strong word. Notice where it's placed at the end of a stanza and at the end of a line. Is there an we notice some basic things of construction with this poem. Every stanza has 4 lines, for example. Is there a rhyme scheme? Is there a metric pattern? Are there a certain number of syllables in each line of this poem? So what we have to understand is she has made a conscious choice in putting this word at the end of the line and at the end of the stanza to be able to draw attention to it and to be able to do that. Anyone know the term that we would use to describe this? Very close. It does involve free verse, but this deals with the choice of what to leave at the end of a line and not completing a thought. This is an example of what we call enjambment. Yeah, and we've brought this word up before. Here's what's key about bringing it up and pointing it out. 1, does the AP test care if you can come up with this word in the moment? Absolutely not. If you as a student can recognize what she's doing and talk about the effect of what she's doing, they're happy with that. They don't need the $10 word for it. But is enjambment listed up in the top for this year when they listed elements? Did they list that?
It's just syntax, which you could say is sentence structure. So that
I would agree with you. It is a form of syntax. It does have some of that. But where I want to point out more is that on our test, we are not going to have anything suggested to us at all. We're going to have to come up with what do we see, what do we know? And sometimes students always want to go back to the same things rather than going, hey, what's something that actually hits on meaning, actually helps to support the arguments that are being made rather than just, oh, look, a metaphor. I know what a metaphor is. That's a metaphor. Yay. So think about moments like this for sure in how we can talk about it and how it helps to develop meaning. Because if we go past even the imperialistic thing, notice what starts line 9 and starts the next stanza. Grand design. So having those words so close to each other helps to build an idea of, hey, what's her complex relationship to plants? How does she view it? Would that maybe, based on your knowledge, especially of imperialism, help to support plant life as deceptive? Did sometimes imperialism present itself as doing something helpful for the people that it was there for, but really it did the exact opposite? So notice there, we go back to how does this support the argument that we're seeing? Anything else stand out to you as you're looking or re-looking at the poem that you thought, wow, this is really important, this is really significant?
I honestly didn't realize how many, references to like, military type stuff are in it.
Mm-hmm.
I just saw it as like a charismatic like teacher, like bringing plants, like the idea of what plant life is and how they like reproduce and stuff as like something that people could like understand more.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't realize it was so much heavily involved in military.
Yeah, and if I'm pointing to your point, go and look at stanza 4. This is the one that begins, the world is full of shoots bent on conquest. If you look there, notice how the descriptions have that militaristic quality to them, but is she doing anything other than describing basic biology? I mean, if we break apart the logic of what's there, invasive seedlings seeking wide open spaces. It's spring in Texas. There's stuff blowing around in the air everywhere. It's why your allergies are going crazy. This is what seeds do. But notice how we bring in that conversation again about tone. And through this kind of more militaristic diction, are able to talk about how what is natural really has this quality to it. If we go back to the very beginning, could this help us to understand how plants are deceptive? That what we personally see as nature really is nothing more than a grand design to overtake us. Let's carry this. We talk about how in poetry we can see it in one place, but can we carry it and show that it's an intentional design point on the author's point? Can we see the development of the idea? Where can we see that idea develop, that what we may view as natural really has a larger plan behind it, a grand design, as she says? The colonizing ambitions, yeah, if you take a look at the next stanza down, we could link there. What about the very last two stanzas? Yeah, that last stanza gives us this idea of they'll outlast us, and it kind of presents a logical conclusion. Hey, when we die, what happens to our body? It decomposes and the plants eat it. So that concept that we have, how many of you this weekend, it was a great weekend, wonderful outside. How many of you watched somebody do yard work in your neighborhood or around where you live? Most yard work surrounds taming nature. I'm going to cut the grass to the level I want it. I'm going to treat the grass so that only the types of plants I want to survive will thrive here. And anything that I see as a weed goes away. But hey, look at the last word she chooses to put here. Weed. Ultimately, weeds kind of invade that concept. Did you read Scarlet Letter last year? I was really hopeful. I was like, huh? He refused to teach us it, so I'm very, because he hates the book. It's a tough one. There's a lot of beauty to it. And there's a great part at the beginning where they talk about a grass plot. I know. Hawthorne, he's a romantic. He likes to romanticize nature. And so in the first paragraph or first page of the book, he talks about a grass plot in the town. And he talks about how the weeds have invaded the grass plot and are growing up and taking the good. And it's this whole idea of sin and evil worked into, hey, grass and weeds. But we see Olive Senior kind of hitting on this same point differently. But in this concept of what we think that we tame, ultimately we can't. It will win out on us. And so notice as we're bringing these things up, do you see how we're constantly going to, what's the thing in the line? What's the quote? We're able to talk about what does it do, but we're also able to talk about, hey, how does it help us here? I want to skip to this point, implied audience. I want to make sure we cover this. What did you notice about the implied audience here in this poem? What are things that drew your attention?
You're unaware of the nature of plants.
She keeps coming back to this idea of, as speaker, she is aware of something the audience doesn't seem to be. What is her tone in addressing the audience, though?
Very humorous.
Mm-hmm.
There's like the excuse me after saying how they breathe and stuff. So it's very like entertainment based.
There's that level of entertainment to it. And notice where that excuse me is. Think about plant breeding. Like, it's asexual. It's, the seed gets there and then it does and then boom. Versus if we talk about human breeding, oh, that's totally different. Ooh, whoa, that's it has a definite gratuitous end to it. And so notice how that humor becomes elevated because we don't think about plants in the same way, but she wants us to. Think about them as having that same idea as humans. So there's a humorous part to how she talks to her audience. Did anyone notice anything different?
I mean,
Or then maybe how it says, "Don't deny it, my dear," like kind of like as if the person were to respond and they're like, "You're taking it too seriously. There's plants."
Yeah. So how would you describe that tone that she seems to have there? That if the audience was going to come back with, dude, they're plants. Come on. Do you have a word that maybe you could use to describe her approach? Now, I'm not going to tell you that these are definite, perfect, 100% awesome words to use, but could we describe this as defensive? She's anticipating their response, and in anticipating it, she's a little defensive towards their potential attitude. I think I might also even throw in a word like condescending. As a speaker, she seems to feel a sense of superiority over her perceived audience and often talks down to them in their naivete or their simplicity. You notice there in this part, don't deny it, my dear, as well as, if you look at line 26, right after it, she says, "I've seen you sniff and exclaim." And she says, "Believe me, innocent, that sweet fruit, that berry is nothing more than ovary." Notice that innocent is capitalized. It is not lowercase. And so who is she using that word to describe? The audience. And it's not meant to be like nice. It's meant to kind of be like, "Oh, you dummy." It's kind of like, how Texans use that phrase, "bless your heart." And it seems really sweet, but really we all understand that it's that tone towards like calling you a dumbass in some way. Think about how we have something similar here in her approach. Time and again, she comes up with this. The breeding, even notice in the third stanza, she phrases most of the third stanza as a question. Perhaps you've regarded as beneath your notice, that they're everywhere. This leading question and statement thing kind of brings about this idea of superiority. Think for a second. What's the purpose of a rhetorical question?
Not for the person to answer.
Why don't they have to answer?
Because it's obvious.
It's obvious. So the purpose of the rhetorical question is to pose the thought that's obvious and to get the reader to do it. Do you pose a rhetorical question that you're not sure of the meaning of, that you can't control the answer to? So think about how here in how she uses this, it definitely brings about this sense of, I know more than you. And like you think you have it, but man, you don't know it all. Go back to that student. I showed you that tweet that Olive Senior got from the student that wanted to ask about white colonizers, right? And she was just like, "There's lots of answers, sweetie." You almost see that same approach. Now, not as bad, but you almost see it there too, where she's opening it up to, if I told you that it means this one thing, I've now closed off any other approach. Does this poem have to be about white colonizers? Huh? Could be just about plants. But even still, do we see behaviors like this outside of imperialistic and colonizing folks? Can you think of someone in your life that you would describe it as deceptive? Because it seems like they're doing one thing, but they're doing something completely different. All right. Linked on today's page, I also put the released student samples. The first two that are there are the higher scored ones, and they do a really good job of balancing a few things. And I want to point out what they do well as we wrap. One, they're able to talk about the three sides of this question, to be able to say, what is that relationship? And especially if we view this in the way that we have today, plants are deceptive. How does the plant life depicted as deceptive, help us to understand the speaker's kind of insight and how they approach speaking to their implied audience with that attitude a bit, as though they know everything and, oh, sweetie, you just wish you knew. They're able to handle that well. The higher scored essays are able to pull just what they need. They don't pull the entire phrase or the entire line. At times, they just pull the specific words. They're also focused on big ideas. They don't get lost in the weeds of, let me write a whole paragraph about diction. No. They instead are able to look at, how do these ideas develop within the piece? How does the author make these conscious choices? Let me see. That's all that I have. I'm going to hit this. So what do we